Welcome everyone. Today we are exploring a profoundly transformative era in music history, the Romantic period. Interestingly, many of the terms we use to designate historical periods in the arts, like Baroque, were applied by historians long after the fact. The term Romantic, however, was proudly used by the Romantics themselves. The word originally traced its roots back to literature and medieval romance, essentially meaning love. By the time the earliest Romantic composers began their careers in the 1820s, their literary contemporaries were already excitedly buzzing about Romantic music. This era marked a massive elevation in how music was perceived. It shifted from being treated as functional background entertainment to being respected as a major, highly revered art form. The prestige and power that had historically been reserved for literary giants like Shakespeare and Milton were now freely extended to musical developments. Much of this shift occurred under the towering shadow of Beethoven, whose work had single-handedly changed the public's perception of the artist and vastly expanded the emotional capacity of music. At the very heart of the Romantic movement was a striving for a better, higher, and more ideal state of being. The Industrial Revolution was well underway, and as the 19th century progressed, people felt increasingly helpless in the face of developing capitalism, factories, slag heaps, and inhumane working conditions. The smokestacks of what the poet William Blake referred to as these dark satanic mills loomed over the European landscape, creating a desperate, understandable need for escapism. The Romantic ideal offered a way out. If the mechanized everyday life seemed dull and meaningless, it could be transcended through the free exercise of individual will and passion. The philosophical groundwork for this was laid by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, hailed as the father of the French Revolution, who championed natural human feelings over the artificial constraints imposed by society. The rule of feeling, unconstrained by convention, religion, or social taboos, became the ultimate good. This gave rise to the archetype of the bohemian, an artist who led an irregular life, wore odd clothes, and proclaimed romantic love and intense personal expression as their highest pursuits. This intense focus on the individual naturally aligned with the political climate of the era, an age of literal and social upheaval. Following the American Revolution, the French Revolution of 1789 rocked Europe, sending aftershocks across the continent, culminating in the major uprisings of 1848. In this environment, the barriers of hereditary nobility were breached, granting the lower and middle classes unprecedented social mobility. Consequently, Romantics were inevitably cast in the role of rebels against the established order. The musician as a rebel became a recurring theme. It started early with Beethoven and his revolutionary Eroica Symphony. Later, Franz Liszt briefly espoused a strange, half-communistic, half-religious movement in France. Giuseppe Verdi's very name became a secret acronym for the Italian liberation movement. And Richard Wagner was actually exiled from Germany in 1849 after making inflammatory speeches from the revolutionary barricades in Dresden. The Romantics' desperate search for higher experience and more intense expression naturally provoked a massive reaction against the traditional restraints of artistic form. They intensely distrusted abstract, handed-down notions of beauty and decorum that they felt hampered true spontaneity. For instance, 18th-century drama had been hemmed in by strict rules that separated tragedy from comedy and kept noble characters away from commoners. The Romantics overturned this by looking to Shakespeare as their ideal. In Shakespeare's plays, locations change freely, scene by scene. Tragedy mixes with farce, high poetry collides with bawdy prose, and noble characters share the stage with clowns. This lifelike turbulence inspired dozens of musical works by Mendelssohn, Berlioz, Tchaikovsky, Wagner, and Verdi. Within music itself, composers actively worked to break down barriers. They experimented with imaginative new harmonies and chord progressions that had previously been strictly forbidden. Classical structures like sonata form were treated so freely that Robert Schumann eventually labeled his final piano sonata a fantasy, as a dual proclamation of his spontaneity and as insurance against critics accusing him of breaking the rules. Because the Romantic movement was so intent on transcending the ordinary, the supernatural, often linked to the bizarre and the macabre, loomed incredibly large in their art. We see this in literary milestones of the era. Goethe's Faust explored the idea of selling one's soul to the devil for a moment of transcendent happiness. While Mary Shelley terrified readers with Frankenstein in 1818. In 1815, Schubert wrote a terrifying musical setting of The Erlking, about a demon claiming a terrified child. The new musical freedoms bolstered this occult fascination, allowing composers to cultivate strange, eerie harmonies and sinister orchestral sounds that are still used today for special effects on movie soundtracks. The operatic world embraced the occult enthusiastically, seen in Weber's famous scene of devilish conjuration in The Magic Bullet, the spooky witches in Verdi's Macbeth, and the ghostly crew in Wagner's The Flying Dutchman. In the orchestral realm, Hector Berlioz pushed boundaries with his fantastic symphony, writing a vivid, terrifying movement, literally titled Dream of a Witch's Sabbath. In this highly emotive and individualist climate, artists made concerted efforts to blend the arts together, completely blurring traditional boundaries. Poetry became more musical, paintings were given poetic titles, and artists across disciplines cultivated half-obscure verbal meanings, ambiguous shapes, and evocative color blends. This blurring peaked with Wagner's concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total artwork, which sought to seamlessly merge poetry, drama, music, and stagecraft. A major driver behind this was the pursuit of the sublime. Rather than admiring nature for its simple, picturesque qualities, artists aimed to capture its majesty, mystery, boundlessness, and even its menace. The great Romantic artists stared unblinkingly at the infinite and tried to set it down in their art. Because music lacked physical words or representational images, it was uniquely positioned to express pure, continuous, infinite inner experience. This boundless quality gave music a special prestige, leading philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche to place it at the absolute heart of their worldviews, elevating it as the supreme art. To visually understand this concept of the sublime, we can look at the artwork of the era. The romantic obsession with raw, untamed nature is perfectly encapsulated here, where nature is depicted not as a serene, controlled garden, but as something thrilling and intensely menacing. Notice the artist's placement of humanity. The solitary bard stands on the precipice, physically dwarfed by the scale of the landscape around him, yet he remains commanding and emotionally defiant in spirit. Visual artists desperately attempted to capture the continuous emotional depth of music within their static forms. As the famous Victorian critic Walter Pater summarized this cultural shift, all art aspires to the condition of music. Moving from ideals to the marketplace, the 19th century witnessed a definitive transition in concert life. The old system of aristocratic patronage faded, and the public concert hall, along with the opera house, came to completely dominate the presentation of music. Every town of any size established its own civic symphony association, organized by middle-class merchants, lawyers, and officials as an expression of civic pride. A prime example was the grand opening of Carnegie Hall in New York in 1891, inaugurated with a massive 5-concert music festival conducted by Tchaikovsky himself. Interestingly, to meet consumer demand, even intimate domestic genres like German lieder and string quartets, originally designed for private drawing rooms, were forcefully moved onto the large public concert stage. Improved transportation also ushered in the era of global touring. Musicians traveled far and wide, bringing Italian Romantic opera to the American West, Buenos Aires, and even far up the Amazon River to the booming rubber town of Manaus. However, the institutionalization of concert life created a problematic dynamic. Composers now depended entirely on the public for their income, but a paradoxical chasm widened between them. The middle-class audience was decidedly conservative. They bought tickets wanting guaranteed value, which to them meant established masterpieces they already knew and liked. Unlike some old aristocratic patrons, this new audience rarely encouraged composers to forge new paths. Meanwhile, the innovative composer placed a premium on breaking barriers and expressing intense personal emotion. They often felt alienated, neglected, and resentful of these conservative consumer tastes. In response to this backlash, Robert Schumann founded an influential magazine to champion serious romantic music. He invented a fictional League of David to symbolically slay the Goliaths of the concert audience, firmly cementing the term Philistine for uncultured, close-minded listeners. This hostility was real. Giants like Liszt and Wagner were routinely attacked by critics as formless and over-emotional, and Gustav Mahler's symphonies were repeatedly rejected by audiences in Vienna. Despite their individual eccentricities, Romantic composers shared a common musical language, and the most instantly recognizable feature of that language was their melodic style. Melodies became vastly more emotional, effusive, and demonstrative. They ranged much more widely than the orderly tunes of the classical era and utilized irregular rhythms and phrase structures to sound entirely spontaneous. A perfect example is the famous love theme from Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet. The melody features a great outburst, a massive climax right at the very start, and then sinks down an octave in sensuous, yearning curves. Tchaikovsky then builds tension using irregular sequences. A rhythmic figure surges upwards exactly 7 times in a row, building immense emotional pressure. All of this tension perfectly prepares the listener for an explosive, fortissimo return to the opening climax. To support these soaring melodies, harmony underwent a revolution. Harmony was no longer just structural support, it was savored for its own sake. Composers invented new chord forms and radical juxtapositions to directly bring out a melody's emotionality. By expanding this sonic palette, these unexpected chords contributed directly to the mysterious, sinister, rapturous, and ethereal moods the Romantics sought to evoke. A key driver of this was chromaticism. While classical music generally stuck to an orderly 7-note major or minor scale, Romantics liberally employed all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. This vastly expanded their expressive range. This chromatic experimentation was carried furthest in the 19th century by Richard Wagner, directly paving the way for the radical musical modernism of the 20th century. The general Romantic tendency to blur sharp visual edges translated directly to musical rhythm through the practice of tempo rubato, or simply rubato. Rubato literally means robbed time, meaning the meter is handled flexibly in performance. Time stolen from one beat is given back to the next. In classical meter, it was considered bad taste to deviate, and the accompaniment and melody were expected to remain strictly synchronized. In Romantic expressivity, however, the melody might waver while the accompaniment stays strict, floating slightly out of phase. This technique was rarely written precisely into the score. Instead, it relied entirely on the performer's sensitivity, feeling, and artistic improvisation to bring the music to life. Alongside melody and harmony, the Romantics seized upon tone color with particular enthusiasm. For the first time in Western music, the sheer sensuous quality of sound assumed major artistic importance on a level equal to rhythm, melody, and form. This led to explosive growth. All instruments underwent major technical developments during this time, and the orchestra was dramatically expanded to its present-day standard makeup. As you can see in the typical Romantic orchestra layout, the ranks of the brass, woodwinds, and percussion were heavily filled out to achieve those rich, blended, multicolored sonic landscapes. This demand for extreme emotionality and chromaticism literally drove the physical reinvention of instruments. Engineering was put to work for emotion. For example, to handle the heavy use of sharp and flat notes required by the chromatic scale. Inventors created bizarre experimental harps that physically crisscrossed 2 complete sets of strings just to accommodate all the extra notes. At the same time, the art of orchestration became a primary focus. Composers learned to mix instrumental colors with the same freedom as painters mixing oils on a palette. The composer Hector Berlioz even wrote a foundational treatise on orchestration, dictating ingenious new combinations of these instruments to completely replace the sharply defined separate sonorities favored during the classical era. With the orchestra growing into a massive 100-piece machine capable of complex chromaticism and delicate rubato, a necessary evolution occurred: the rise of the conductor. In earlier times, smaller orchestras simply followed the first violinist or the continuo player. Now, they required dedicated experts standing at the front to control and balance the ensemble's blended effects. The era saw the birth of conductors wielding batons. Early batons were actually quite massive. The German composer Carl Maria von Weber used a stick resembling a heavy relay race baton. Soon, the conductor became a superstar in their own right, as interpreting the complex emotional nuances of the score became a celebrated art form. Orchestral effects became so paramount that in the works of major opera composers like Wagner, the orchestra sometimes threatened to completely overshadow the vocalists on stage. Another major hallmark of the era was program music, instrumental music written in direct association with a poem, a story, or some other literary source. This answered the general romantic demand for transcending inter-art boundaries, as many felt instrumental music could be made even more expressive by linking it to poetry and ideas. There were two main strategies here. The narrative strategy, championed by Berlioz in his Fantastic Symphony, tells a literal, step-by-step story. Berlioz actually handed out pamphlets at the premiere so audiences could follow the exact moments of the hero's shrieks, groans, and frenzied dances in the music. The mood strategy, often used by Chopin, captures a general flavor without a specific storyline. A single suggestive word like nocturne, night piece, sets up the expectation of nighttime romance, and the music's atmosphere does the rest. This sparked a great debate. Does the music truly illustrate the program, and shouldn't it make sense on its own terms? Ultimately, the Romantics embraced the inconsistency. They revered pure instrumental music as the highest art, yet deeply loved the impure mixing of non-musical stories. Individual spontaneity was the ultimate goal, and composers wanted their music to bubble out moment by moment like irrepressible, churning emotion. But this presented a massive challenge. How do you control that spontaneity so the audience can actually follow along without getting lost in formless chaos? The solution involved purposely breaking classical norms. Composers distrusted standardized forms and allowed themes to blend loosely into one another, avoiding the neat, clear cadencing of classical music. A fascinating case study is Schumann's song Im wunderschönen Monat Mai. The opening begins hesitantly, sounding as though it is already in the middle of a transition, blurring the boundaries between music and silence. After avoiding standardized structures throughout the body, it concludes on an unresolved, questioning dissonance followed by silence, suggesting a typical romantic infinity rather than a decisive classical finish. To balance the need for form with the desire for spontaneous expression, composers gravitated toward two absolute extremes. The first extreme was miniature compositions. These were pieces played on an intimate scale, lasting only a few minutes or even less, and were designed to convey a singularly pointed emotion intensely and intimately. In a miniature, the composer essentially bypasses the problem of form entirely because the piece is over before the listener even begins to wonder where the musical structure is going. The era produced incredible masterpieces in this genre, including Schubert's Impromptus, Brahms's Capriccios, Chopin's Mazurkas, and pieces with highly evocative titles like Liszt's Years of Pilgrimage or Schumann's The Poet Speaks and Why. These works were perfectly suited for the privacy of the middle-class living room, played closely among friends. Diametrically opposed to the miniature was the second extreme, grandiose compositions. These operated on an infinite scale. Immense symphonies, cantatas, and operas requiring massive performing forces and massive lengths of time. Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet Symphony extended boundaries by lasting nearly an hour and a half, vastly longer than a typical 20-minute Haydn symphony, and added vocal soloists, a narrator, and a hidden offstage chorus. Wagner's opera The Nibelungsring took this to the absolute limit, running for 4 entire consecutive evenings and utilizing a massive orchestra, newly invented instruments, a cast of 30, and 15 separate stage sets. These works stupefied listeners with opulent sounds and sheer length. To hold audiences' attention over such vast spans, composers relied heavily on extra musical factors, vocal words, story programs, and philosophical ideas, to supply sequence, reason, and structure to the massive musical form. To maintain coherence over these massive grandiose works, composers developed the crucial principle of thematic unity, reusing thematic material throughout multiple movements. This operated on several levels. First, there was direct return, pioneered in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, where themes from one movement returned clearly and identifiably in later ones. Second, there was thematic transformation, where short themes are freely varied at wide, unpredictable intervals of time, taking on entirely new characters to match evolving storylines. Finally, there were shadowy connections, famously used in Wagner's operas, where themes exhibit mysterious inner similarities, vague suggestions and atmospheric feelings rather than clear likenesses. To appreciate this constantly shifting landscape, the romantic listener cannot be overly literal. The music requires ears that are attentive, imaginative, exploratory, and more than a little fanciful. To review, the Romantic movement represented a massive cultural shift. Music achieved an unprecedented, revered respect as composers, driven by a cult of individual feeling, acted as rebels who violently broke 18th-century classical rules. Musically, the era was defined by wildly emotional melodies, extreme chromatic harmony, the fluid rhythmic freedom of tempo rubato, and a massively expanded orchestra led by superstar conductors. The concert hall became an institution, shifting the marketplace to public, middle-class symphony associations, which tragically created a paradoxical divide between conservative audiences and boundary-pushing artists. Finally, to capture the true spontaneity of the human heart, composers navigated the absolute extremes of scale, contrasting fiercely intimate miniatures with awe-inspiring, grandiose programmatic works united by thematic transformation. Now, let's watch a more fun summary.
In the early 19th century, the physical reality of Europe was changing. People were suddenly confronted by the massive factories, slag heaps, and inhumane working conditions of the developing Industrial Revolution. William Blake referred to these rising industrial centers as dark satanic mills. Faced with the helplessness generated by this mechanization, society needed an escape. They found it in the arts. The Enlightenment's focus on logic gave way to something new. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau laid the groundwork for the cult of individual feeling. Under this ideology, the free exercise of individual will and passion, entirely unconstrained by social convention, became the highest artistic goal. This shift took hold in literature first, championed by poets like Wordsworth, Shelley, and Byron. By the time the next generation of composers began their careers in the 1820s, they adopted the label romantic to describe their own music. Because of this ideological shift, music was treated with a new respect in cultivated circles. It was taken seriously in a way it never had been before. Joseph Donhauser's 1840 painting captures this perfectly. Famous literary figures sit reverently around Franz Liszt, their expressions showing how profoundly the music moves them. Music had outgrown its role as casual background entertainment. It was now the primary vehicle for individual transcendence. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution came actual revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 rocked Europe, casting the Romantics directly into the role of rebels against the established political order. Many musicians actively participated in these upheavals. Giuseppe Verdi's name literally became an acronym for the Italian liberation movement. Richard Wagner was thrown out of Germany in 1849 for making inflammatory speeches from the barricades. This political defiance bled directly into their art. Composers began to distrust abstract notions of beauty and the strict rules of classical decorum, viewing them as restraints on their own spontaneity. They found a model in William Shakespeare. His plays ignored classical unities, changing scenes rapidly and mixing high tragedy with bawdy farce. Composers emulated this lifelike turbulence by breaking down the barriers of harmony and form. They experimented with chord progressions that had previously been forbidden and began treating the strict sonata form with extreme freedom. But Robert Schumann took this even further. He labeled his final, greatest piano sonata a fantasy. It was a title that served as both a proclamation of his spontaneity and an insurance policy against accusations of rule-breaking. Dismantling classical musical structure was a deliberate political declaration of artistic and personal freedom. The Romantics aimed to capture a quality they called the sublime, an aesthetic obsession with depicting the majesty, mystery, and boundless menace of nature. You can see this in J.M.W. Turner's painting Snowstorm, where nature merges into dizzy, almost abstract swirls of color, nearly swallowing a boat whole. To transcend the ordinary, artists also turned to the supernatural and the macabre. In Henry Fuseli's painting Nightmare, a dream is made concrete and visible in the form of a horrible ogre. Composers cultivated strange harmonies and sinister orchestral sounds to match this mood. Carl Maria von Weber used them for devilish conjurations in his opera Der Freischütz, and Wagner devised spooky music for a ghost ship in The Flying Dutchman. In this climate, artists tried to blend mediums together. Poetry became more musical, and paintings and musical works were given poetic titles. This culminated in Richard Wagner's concept of Gesamtkunstwerk. It translates to total artwork, a system where poetry, drama, music, and stagecraft completely merge to capture the infinite. Philosophers argued that music was the highest of these arts. Its boundless quality meant the musician's imagination was not tied down to the literal meaning of words or the physical representation of objects. Composers engineered an acoustic experience that mirrored the boundless, thrilling, and menacing qualities of the sublime. To simulate this intense, spontaneous emotion, composers had to completely overhaul the theoretical mechanics of music. This sheet music shows the love theme from Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet. Romantic melodies became more effusive and demonstrative, building up to sustained climaxes. They became irregular in rhythm, as seen in the shaded sequence here, building tension before the climax returns. To support these melodies, composers expanded their use of chromaticism. It liberally employs all 12 notes of the chromatic scale, rather than just the 7 notes of a major or minor scale. This allowed them to evoke mysterious, ethereal, or highly sensuous moods. The demand for these 12 notes was so intense that physical instruments had to adapt. This bizarre experimental harp is actually 2 harps, crisscrossed, specifically designed to accommodate all the notes of the chromatic scale. They also introduced rhythmic freedom through a practice called rubato. Rubato dictates that rhythm is handled flexibly during a performance, allowing the meter to waver and blur the music's sharp edges. While considered bad taste in the classical era, rubato became an essential expressive resource. A musician's sensitivity and feeling now depended heavily on their artistic use of this rhythmic flexibility. This illusion of wild, unrestrained passion was entirely the result of radical, systematic advances in musical mechanics. As composers seized upon tone color, the sheer sensuous quality of sound, they required a massive expansion of physical orchestral forces. This chart shows the precise ranks of a typical romantic orchestra. The string sections grew, and the brass, woodwind, and percussion sections were significantly filled out to achieve richer effects. Composers learned to mix these instrumental colors with the freedom of a painter mixing shades, replacing sharply defined classical sonorities with multicolored blended sound. Orchestras could no longer simply follow the first violinist. They required a specialized conductor, wielding a baton, to control and balance these massive, complex forces and perfectly time those special blended effects. The Romantic obsession with sensuous sound successfully engineered the modern symphony orchestra. With these new tools, Romantic composers channeled their ideals into two diametrically opposed compositional forms. First was the miniature. These were songs and short piano pieces lasting only a few minutes, designed to convey a pointed, undeveloped emotion. They were intensely private, typically performed in the middle-class living room. On the other extreme were grandiose compositions. These involved massive performing forces, increased movements, and enormous lengths. Hector Berlioz added vocal soloists, a chorus, and a narrator, and then threw in an off-stage chorus just to achieve his opulent, powerful effects. To link these instrumental works to non-musical ideas, composers embraced program music. Program music is instrumental music written in association with a poem, a story, or a suggestive word to transcend inter-art boundaries. But this created a problem. Whether a piece was a spontaneous miniature or a massive hour-long symphony, composers needed a way to control the form so listeners could actually follow it. Their solution is the principle of thematic unity, maintaining the exact same thematic material throughout whole works. They executed this through thematic transformation, where short themes were freely varied at unpredictable intervals, providing internal coherence without strict classical rules. These forms, microscopic or massive, were meticulously engineered to deliver a focused emotional narrative without collapsing into noise. The massive performative demands of this era required a new commercial reality. Public concerts grew exponentially, and every town of any size developed a symphony association. Halls were built to accommodate these concerts as expressions of civic pride. Here you see the 1891 groundbreaking ceremony for Carnegie Hall in New York, a literal industrial foundation being laid for the new concert world. But this institutionalization created a paradox. The middle-class buyers wanted value, which meant they preferred established masterpieces they already knew and liked. Composers with an interest in innovation felt neglected by this concert world. Their dependence on the public was tinged with resentment. Robert Schumann founded a magazine to campaign against the public's preference for flashy trivia. He even invented an imaginary League of David, tasked with striking down the Philistines of the conservative concert audience. This hostility only widened. Later, the symphonies of Gustav Mahler were repeatedly rejected by audiences in Vienna, despite his important position as head of the opera there. This gap between innovative music and a conservative concert public set the tone for modern musical life, establishing the classical music tradition exactly as it still exists today. The Romantic era successfully elevated the composer to the status of a hero, but in doing so, it permanently fractured the link between the artist and the public.